They thought a few rules could stop me from seeing my own grandparents. The HOA locked me out of their nursing home, enforcing some ridiculous community regulation to keep outsiders away. But what they didn't know was that my uncle wasn't just any man. He was a federal judge with the power to make their entire existence disappear. What would you do if a power-hungry HOA tried to keep you away from your family? Welcome to my channel. If you love HOA revenge stories, hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss this one. I moved into Maple Ridge Estates last year to be closer to my grandparents, who lived in the nearby Willow Crest nursing home. They'd been in this community for over 2 decades, long before the HOA had any real power. But that changed when Eleanor Prescott became president. She wasn't just strict. She was a control freak and designer heels, enforcing rules that seemed designed more for personal satisfaction than actual neighborhood upkeep. I learned that firsthand when I received my first violation notice within 2 weeks of moving in, a bright red slip taped to my front door citing my unauthorized street parking. My crime? Parking in my own driveway. At first, I brushed it off as an overzealous HOA flex. But then came the garbage can citation for placing my bin out too early, followed by a warning about my grass being 1 inch over the acceptable height. It was clear Eleanor had chosen me as her new target, but I ignored it all, focusing on my real reason for moving, to visit my grandparents as often as I could. That was until I pulled into the Willow Crest parking lot one afternoon and found Eleanor standing there, clipboard in hand, a smug expression plastered across her Botoxed face. "You can't park here," she announced before I even stepped out of my car. I frowned, glancing around at the half-empty lot. "This is a public nursing home." She shook her head. Under new HOA regulations, only registered residents or their immediate caregivers are allowed visitor parking. Unauthorized visitors require advance approval. I almost laughed. "I'm visiting my grandparents, Eleanor. I don't need permission." Her thin lips curled into a smirk. "I'm afraid you do." She handed me a printed notice. Effective immediately, all non-resident visitors must submit a request for entry 72 hours in advance. Your name is already flagged as a repeat offender of HOA guidelines, so additional approvals will be required for any future visits. My hands clenched around the paper. "You have no authority over this place," I snapped. "The HOA doesn't control a private nursing home." Eleanor's smirk widened. "Actually, we do. Willow Crest is within our jurisdiction, and as of last month, we formalized an agreement with management to ensure all visitors comply with HOA security policies." I could barely believe what I was hearing. "You mean you bullied them into this?" She didn't answer, just tapped her clipboard and motioned toward the exit. "You'll need to leave now. Come back when you've gone through the proper channels." I knew I should have walked away, but rage burned in my chest. "You're keeping me from seeing my family." Eleanor adjusted her pearl necklace. "Rules are rules, Mr. Davis. If you don't like them, perhaps this isn't the right community for you." I wanted to argue, but 2 security guards, ones I'd never seen before, stepped up beside her. They weren't part of Willow Crest staff. They were HOA hired, wearing navy polos with the association's logo printed across their chests. My stomach turned. This was planned. Eleanor wasn't just enforcing some arbitrary rule. She had put an actual system in place to keep outsiders, specifically me, out. I looked past her, through the glass doors where I could see my grandmother sitting in the common area, unaware that I was being blocked from stepping inside. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "You're going to regret this, Eleanor," she chuckled, tapping her clipboard against her palm. "I doubt it. Now, leave before we have to escalate this to trespassing." My jaw clenched as I turned and walked back to my car, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. If she thought I was just going to roll over and accept this, she had no idea who she was dealing with. I didn't need an appeal form or an HOA approval. I needed one phone call. And lucky for me, my uncle was the last person Eleanor should have pissed off. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wasn't just furious, I was calculating. Eleanor thought she had won, thought I'd accept my punishment like some obedient resident afraid of her ridiculous rules. But she had no idea that my uncle, Judge Samuel Davis, had spent the last 30 years unraveling power-hungry bureaucrats exactly like her. The moment I walked through my front door, I dialed his number. "What's wrong?" he answered immediately, always able to hear when I was barely containing my rage. The HOA just banned me from visiting Grandma and Grandpa, I spat, pacing across my living room. They put new rules in place at the nursing home, claiming they have jurisdiction. They've hired their own security, flagged my name, and are making it impossible for me to visit without advance permission. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, a low, amused chuckle. That's adorable, my uncle finally said. They think they have more power than the law. I heard papers shuffling, the distinct clack of his keyboard as he immediately started looking into the situation. Send me everything, the violation notices, the visitor policy, even the names of the security guards if you can get them. Already on it. I forwarded the emails and scanned notices while he kept talking. I need to see exactly how far they've stretched their authority. If they've overstepped, and I'm already sure they have, then this entire HOA is about to collapse under its own weight. I smirked, some of the fury inside me easing at his calm, methodical approach. What do you need me to do? He exhaled slowly. For now, nothing. Let them think they've won. The moment they believe you've backed down, they'll get sloppy. If Eleanor is anything like the power-hungry frauds I've dealt with, she'll overreach. And when she does, we'll be ready. For the next 2 days, I played the perfect role. I didn't fight back publicly, didn't argue with any HOA members, or attempt to force my way into Willow Crest. I even ignored the smug glances from my neighbors who were clearly gossiping about my supposed defeat. But behind the scenes, my uncle had already launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's legal standing. It didn't take him long to find cracks in their foundation. They're operating with outdated zoning permits, he told me late one night over the phone. Their jurisdiction over the nursing home is questionable at best. They used a loophole that technically shouldn't apply, and I found records of them pressuring Willow Crest's management into an agreement that's legally unenforceable. Even better? He chuckled. The HOA's financials are a mess. That caught my attention. Mess how? Fraud, misallocated funds, possible embezzlement. I've seen enough in the past 24 hours to bury Eleanor and her entire board. But we don't just want to win. His voice darkened. We want to humiliate them. I leaned back in my chair, a slow grin forming. What's the plan? We let them make the next move. He paused. And trust me, they will. They always do. The next day, I got exactly what I was waiting for. Another HOA notice taped to my door, this time informing me that due to my continued hostile attitude and failure to comply with community standards, my property would be subject to an emergency hearing regarding my residency. I laughed out loud. They were trying to kick me out. I took a picture and sent it to my uncle. They took the bait. His response was instant. Perfect. Now we strike. That evening, we put the final pieces together. My uncle filed an official complaint with the county, citing the HOA's illegal overreach and financial misconduct. But we weren't stopping at a simple lawsuit. We were taking it straight to the state level. They want to play by their own rules, my uncle said as he submitted the paperwork. Let's see how they like it when they're banned from the entire county. The next morning, Eleanor and the HOA board had no idea their carefully constructed empire was already crumbling. They probably woke up feeling powerful, thinking they had finally silenced me, thinking I was scrambling to appeal my pending emergency hearing. But while they were sipping their overpriced lattes and congratulating themselves on tightening their grip over the neighborhood, my uncle's complaint had already reached the county commissioner's desk, the state attorney's office, and, just for good measure, one of the most aggressive investigative journalists in the area. Eleanor wanted power. She was about to see what real power looked like. By noon, the first cracks in her kingdom started to show. My uncle called me with an update, his voice filled with the kind of satisfaction that only came from watching corrupt bureaucrats walk straight into a trap. They've been siphoning community funds, he said, his tone almost amused. Moving HOA money into private accounts, issuing fraudulent fines, overcharging residents for community upkeep while funneling the excess into personal investments. It's classic embezzlement, and they were sloppy. I've already flagged multiple suspicious transactions with the county finance office. I grinned, picturing Eleanor's perfectly composed face twisting in panic as she realized her little dictatorship was under audit. How long before she knows? I asked. Oh, I'd say about 5 minutes. Right on cue, I heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching outside. Peeking through my window, I watched as Eleanor's black SUV swerved into my driveway, stopping just short of my front steps. The door flew open, and out she stormed, her expression a mixture of barely contained rage and thinly veiled desperation. "You think this is funny?" she spat the moment I stepped outside. "Whatever stunt you think you're pulling, it won't work." I crossed my arms, leaning casually against my porch railing. "Oh, Eleanor, you really should read the bylaws you love so much. This isn't a stunt, it's just accountability." Her nostrils flared. "You reported false claims to the county," she accused. "And now they're threatening to freeze our accounts, pending investigation." I raised an eyebrow. "False claims?" "Because from what I've seen, and what my uncle, the federal judge, has seen, those numbers don't lie. But by all means, keep talking. I'm sure the authorities would love to hear more about how you've been mismanaging thousands of dollars." Her confidence flickered, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed. "I have friends in this town." "Really?" I smirked. "Because from what I hear, a lot of your friends are about to be subpoenaed." That did it. For the first time, real fear flashed across her face. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but before she could speak, another car pulled up, a county vehicle. A man in a suit stepped out, a folder in hand, and the moment Eleanor saw him, she went rigid. "Mrs. Prescott," the county investigator said, flipping through his papers, "you've been formally served. We need to discuss the financial irregularities reported under your administration." The blood drained from Eleanor's face, but she wasn't the only one frozen in place. Across the street, neighbors had started gathering, whispering among themselves, watching their once untouchable HOA president get publicly humiliated in broad daylight. I caught a glimpse of Martin, her smug vice president, lingering near his front door, gripping his phone as if trying to figure out whether to run or pretend he wasn't involved. I almost laughed. It was like watching a castle collapse in real time. Eleanor finally managed to regain some of her composure. "This is outrageous," she snapped at the investigator. "We follow all county regulations." "Actually," the investigator interrupted, "preliminary findings suggest otherwise. And under county fraud statutes, misappropriation of funds can result in criminal charges." That was it. That was the moment Eleanor realized she had lost. Her entire body stiffened, her hands gripping her expensive blazer like she could somehow wring control back into existence. But it was too late. The law was already in motion. As the investigator escorted her toward his vehicle, I stepped forward, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "You banned me from visiting my grandparents," I murmured. "Now you're banned from this entire county." Eleanor turned to glare at me one last time, but there was no fire left in her eyes, only the dawning horror of a woman who had finally realized she was no longer in control. She didn't say a word as she climbed into the car. The moment the door slammed shut, Martin bolted from his house, disappearing down the street like a rat, abandoning a sinking ship. The HOA board members who had once stood so proudly beside Eleanor suddenly looked anywhere but in my direction. One by one, they slinked back into their houses, realizing that their reign of terror had just ended. A slow clap started from across the street, and when I turned, I saw Mrs. Thompson, the sweet old woman who had lived in this neighborhood longer than anyone, grinning as she applauded. Within seconds, others joined in. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out, too intimidated by Eleanor's rule, were now cheering. "Took long enough," someone muttered. Another person called out, "Drinks at my place tonight, on me!" The tension that had gripped this neighborhood for years finally cracked, replaced with something that had been missing for too long: relief. As the county car pulled away, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My phone buzzed. A message from my uncle. "Good work. It's over." I smirked as I typed back, "Oh no, Uncle Sam, it's just getting started." Because while Eleanor's personal reign had ended, the HOA itself was still standing, and I had no intention of letting it survive. The fallout from Eleanor's downfall was immediate and absolute. By the next morning, word had spread like wildfire, not just through our neighborhood, but across the entire county. Local news stations picked up the story, running headlines like, "HOA President under investigation for financial misconduct," and "Community residents fight back against overreaching HOA." The footage of Eleanor being escorted into the county vehicle was replayed on every channel, cementing her legacy as nothing more than a disgraced dictator who had overplayed her hand. But I wasn't done yet. My uncle had taken down Eleanor, but the HOA itself was still standing, still technically operational, still full of power-hungry board members who had supported her every move. If I wanted to finish this, I needed to dismantle the entire system, piece by piece. The first step? Destroying their authority from within. I spent the morning gathering more evidence, printing every document my uncle had uncovered, every fraudulent expense report, every shady transaction, every single instance where the HOA had overstepped their legal jurisdiction. Then I took it straight to the HOA emergency meeting they had scheduled that evening, no doubt hoping to recover from the mess. The meeting room was packed when I walked in, and the moment I entered, the entire board went silent. They knew exactly why I was there. Martin, who had somehow slithered his way into temporary leadership after Eleanor's exit, cleared his throat and attempted to sound in control. "This meeting is to discuss the transition of leadership within the HOA," he announced. "Given recent events, we need to ensure that our community remains." I cut him off by dropping a thick stack of files onto the table, loudly. "I think we should discuss this first." I pressed the button on the projector, and the room dimmed as the first slide appeared, a full breakdown of the missing $370,000 from HOA funds. Gasps rippled through the crowd and Martin paled. "Where did that money go?" I asked, my voice calm but deadly. "Because according to these records, none of it was spent on community maintenance." I clicked to the next slide, highlighting illegally issued fines, each traced back to either Eleanor or her closest allies. Then came the most damning evidence, emails confirming that Willowcrest Nursing Home had been pressured into signing the HOA visitation policy, under threat of being cut off from community resources. The uproar was immediate. Homeowners shot to their feet, shouting over one another, demanding answers. Martin raised his hands, panicked. "Let's all remain calm." "Calm?" Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who had cheered for me the day before, stormed toward the front. "You let that woman fine me thousands of dollars over a rose garden, but you were stealing money the whole time?" "This is all being taken out of context," Martin started, but I wasn't finished. "And let's not forget," I continued, flipping to the last slide, "that the HOA has no actual legal authority to enforce half of these rules. Due to Eleanor's failure to update the association's registration with the county, their charter expired 3 years ago. That was it, the final nail in the coffin. The HOA hadn't been legally recognized for years. Every fine issued, every rule enforced, every dollar collected, invalid. Martin looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. The crowd exploded with angry voices, residents demanding refunds, threatening lawsuits, calling for the HOA to be abolished entirely. I stepped forward, standing directly in front of Martin, my voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "This organization is done." I turned toward the crowd. "And we have two choices. We can spend the next few months filing legal challenges to untangle this mess, or we can vote to dissolve the HOA right now." Silence fell as the weight of my words settled over the room. People turned to one another, whispering. Then, from the back, a single voice spoke up. "I vote to dissolve," Mrs. Thompson, standing tall despite her age. Then another voice. "I second it." Then another. "I third it." "Motion to dissolve," someone else called out. "I second the motion." I watched as hands shot up across the room. Martin's face twisted in panic. Wait, you can't, just." "Yes, we can," I interrupted, pulling out a printed copy of the HOA bylaws and flipping to the dissolution clause. "It takes a 75% majority vote to terminate the association, and I think you're outnumbered." I raised my own hand. "All in favor?" The response was instantaneous. Hands flew up across the room. More than 3/4 of the homeowners, fed up with years of oppression, corruption, and nonsense rules, voted the HOA out of existence. Martin sat there, stunned, as the weight of it hit him. It was over. The HOA no longer existed. The moment the vote was counted, cheers erupted. People hugged. Some even cried, relieved to finally be free from the tyranny that had ruled over them for years. I stood back, watching the chaos unfold, feeling a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd ever known. It was done. I had done what Eleanor thought was impossible. I hadn't just won against the HOA. I had erased it from existence. The next morning, I drove straight to Willowcrest, past the now empty security checkpoint, walked through the front doors without resistance, and finally, sat with my grandparents. My grandmother took my hand, smiling through teary eyes. "I knew you'd fix it," she whispered. My grandfather chuckled, squeezing my shoulder. "Knew that judge uncle of yours would come in handy someday." I just grinned. Turns out, Eleanor was right about one thing, I said, leaning back in my chair. Rules are rules, and now, she doesn't get to make them anymore. The HOA was gone, wiped from existence by an overwhelming vote, but I knew better than to think the battle was truly over. People like Eleanor and Martin didn't just disappear quietly. They schemed, they plotted, they found ways to claw their way back into power through loopholes and technicalities. Sure enough, 2 days after the vote, I woke up to find a legal notice taped to my door, this time not from the HOA, but from Eleanor's personal attorney. I read the words carefully, my smirk growing with every ridiculous accusation, defamation, harassment, wrongful interference in a private association's governance. It was an intimidation tactic, plain and simple. Eleanor was trying to use the legal system as a weapon, hoping I'd be scared into backing off, but she was too late for that. I wasn't just standing my ground, I was burying her. I forwarded the letter to my uncle, who called me within minutes, barely able to contain his amusement. She's really grasping at straws, he chuckled. This is nothing but a frivolous lawsuit, a scare tactic. She has no standing because, legally, the HOA no longer exists. She's desperate, I agreed. She knows she's lost, my uncle hummed in thought. That doesn't mean she won't keep trying. We need to make sure she can't bounce back from this. He paused, then added, let's finish the job. That afternoon, I met him at the county clerk's office, where we'd arranged to sit down with a senior investigator who had been digging through the HOA's finances since the first complaint was filed. The moment we walked in, he handed us a folder thicker than a legal textbook. I don't know how this went unchecked for so long, he admitted, shaking his head. There are dozens of suspicious financial transactions. Money moved between HOA accounts and private LLCs, all linked to Eleanor and Martin. Landscaping contracts signed with fake companies. Illegal fines collected from homeowners and never reported on the books. Even property seizures that were flipped for profit. I glanced through the papers, my stomach turning at the sheer depth of the corruption. And the kicker? The investigator added, sliding another document toward us. Martin's been illegally squatting in his home for over a year. He defaulted on his mortgage, but he used HOA funds to block foreclosure proceedings by paying off the right people. I nearly laughed. So he was stealing from everyone just to keep his own house? Exactly. And now that the HOA is dissolved, those protections are gone. The bank's been trying to process his eviction for months. And Eleanor? My uncle asked, flipping through more documents. The investigator smirked. Her hands are even dirtier. Not only was she illegally pocketing HOA money, but she's also been double-dipping on county funds. Turns out she was getting grants meant for community improvement projects that were never completed. I exhaled slowly, absorbing all of it. So what happens next? What happens next, the investigator said, sitting back, is that Eleanor and Martin are about to have a very bad week. We're filing formal charges for embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion. I couldn't contain my grin. That's quite the list. It didn't take long for everything to come crashing down. The very next morning, police cars rolled into the neighborhood, sirens blaring. Neighbors peeked through curtains as Martin was dragged from his house in handcuffs, kicking and screaming about how he was set up and this is all a misunderstanding. He was still in his bathrobe, hair a mess, as officers read him his rights and shoved him into the back of a squad car. Eleanor wasn't home. No one had seen her since the county investigation was made public, and by noon we had our answer. She had fled, left town, probably hoping to avoid arrest, but it wouldn't last. My uncle made sure of that. He had already contacted federal authorities, ensuring that Eleanor Prescott would soon be the subject of an interstate warrant. With the HOA dead, its leaders disgraced or on the run, the neighborhood finally started to feel free. People were reclaiming their homes, repainting their houses in colors that would have once been non-compliant, replanting trees that Eleanor had forced them to remove, and most importantly, Willow Crest removed every single restriction on visitors. I walked into the nursing home that day with zero resistance, and when my grandmother saw me, she burst into tears. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, hugging me tightly. "We saw the news." My grandfather chuckled from his recliner. Eleanor always thought she ran this town. Guess she learned otherwise. I smiled, sitting down between them. Guess she did. But the best part? That came 2 weeks later. I was drinking coffee on my front porch, finally able to enjoy peace, when a for sale sign went up in front of Eleanor's house. Her assets had been frozen, her remaining properties seized, and now she had nothing left. A car pulled up, and out stepped an older woman with a familiar smirk. Mrs. Thompson, the woman who had been harassed over her rose garden, walked right up to the real estate agent and said, "I'll take it." I blinked, stunned. "You're buying Eleanor's house?" She turned to me, grinning. "She made my life hell for years. Now I'm going to redecorate her home in the most non-compliant way possible. Maybe a giant pink flamingo in the front yard." I laughed. "I'll help you install it." And just like that, Eleanor Prescott's legacy was erased, replaced by the very people she had tried to control. I took a sip of my coffee, leaned back, and enjoyed the sweet, sweet taste of victory.